If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know how hard it can be for employees to build meaningful connections with each other. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that, and they are called Mystery. Mystery has changed the way that I even think about employee engagement. They use the power of data and virtual events to drive employee connections. I actually recently attended a Mystery demo, and let me tell you, I learned so much about the potential behind employee engagement and how Mystery's events drive connection and belonging. So I'm excited to share that there is a special promotion for listeners of my podcast. Thanks to Mystery, you can get your first 2 Mystery events for the price of 1. That is right, 2 events for the price of 1. So if you're looking for a way to improve employee engagement and drive connection in your organization, I highly recommend checking them out. Go to trymystery.com/HR-podcast. That's trymystery.com/HR-podcast to get this special offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click there. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast, or if you're watching me on YouTube or Spotify. I'm looking right at you, right through the camera, which is really hard to train myself to do, but I'm working on it. Anyway, this is probably one of the first solo episodes that I'm recording after having a ton of guest episodes. Normally, I kind of like do the solos and then I have the guests. But I figured, you know what, let me get some guest episodes in for the year, and then let's chat. So we've heard a lot from guests this month about how we can focus on humans, right? How we can think about what we're doing to provide resources for them, how we're, supporting them in business and in industry. And of course, as HR people, or if you're looking to break into HR, that's always going to be like front and center, or so it should be, right? But I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about when HR gets involved, because I think that sometimes we have these conversations, which are obviously really important. We have to talk about what business needs and how we support people, but we don't always then loop back around as to the timing and when HR kind of steps in and gets involved. So I kind of wanted to use this episode to talk through that. Now, what I will preface with is that in every episode, toward the end of every guest episode, I should say, I'm always asking in some way, shape, or form, how can HR apply this? Or sometimes it's not even at the end of the episode. Sometimes it's in the middle of the episode where I say, hey, like how can we advise HR people to jump into this type of situation, right? But this episode specifically is about how and when we like have that trigger, that light bulb moment in our minds to say, oh, now is the time to get involved. So let's first talk about one scenario, which is the most common for us to get involved in, which is like interpersonal conflict between two individuals, maybe more, or as we would call it in the industry, employee relations. If you haven't heard the term employee relations before, I've talked about it a number of times on my podcast, but basically employee relations is just that. All of the details and things that employees are experiencing, but with a specific and fine-tuned focus and detail on interpersonal issues. That's usually what employee relations is kind of involved with. Everything from, just like an argument between two people to harassment between people. So that's when I reference employee relations, that's what I'm referring to. If you're not in HR and you've not heard this term, now you know. If you are not in HR and you have heard this term, but you've always wondered, now you know. So let's take, for example, like I said, a pretty common one, which is an interpersonal conflict. When you have two people in an issue or in a situation where there is some sort of issue, The ideal would be for those individuals to work out their issues together between one another. Let's assume that it's just two people in this scenario. And the reason why I say that is because when one person has an issue with another person and or there's a situation where a person feels that the other person has an issue with them, there's a need to clearly bridge communication gaps and potentially build some trust. But on top of that, when we as HR professionals don't just jump in and get involved, and instead we empower the person who is feeling some kind of way about these communication gaps or about these situations that are kind of taking place, we're empowering them to feel more confident in their own voice, to use their voice. We're empowering them to solve their own problems and challenges. I know that there is sometimes a misconception that someone comes to HR with their problem and HR sends them to go and deal with it, and that HR doesn't help, right? This is a misconception. This is a stigma. Instead, actually, if an HR person is saying, hey, here are the tools to go and solve this problem, and they're sending that person back out into the world to go and handle their challenge, that actually is helping them. And it's our responsibility in these moments when someone potentially comes to us with an issue that we think about, okay, what is my absolute need to get involved? Like, is it obligatory for me to get involved? Or is this an opportunity for me to empower this person who's come to me to handle things amongst themselves? Most of the time, it's going to be the latter, where the person can handle it between themselves and the other person. In the instance where they can't, this is where obviously we would have to jump in. But before I get to that, when you have conversations with someone that lead you to wanting to empower them and solve this problem for themselves, it is really important that you are clear about that and clear about why you are not jumping in. Because I think part of the reason why there's a misconception and a stigma around people go to HR and HR just sends them to go and deal with it anyway is because we are not necessarily taking that extra effort to explain the decision making. So I'm going to role play with myself, for example. If someone comes to me and says, hey, Tracy, I have this issue with my manager or my peer, and I don't really know what to do about it. Can you help me? And maybe the situation is that this person feels like their manager takes away responsibilities from them and makes them feel undervalued, let's just say. And it could be a totally different scenario, but this is, for that person, this is their reality. So for me, my best decision to make here, or the best outcome that I can have from a decision that I make here, is for that employee who has come to me to feel empowered and confident, because already they're not. So to send them back out feeling empowered, feeling more confident, feeling more established in their voice is not only going to help them to continue to build confidence, but it's actually going to help improve their relationships, not only with themselves, but with the people around them. So, because everyone wants to feel empowered and confident. So the more good we can do in building up people, the better it's going to be. So for me, what I would say to this person in this situation, in this example, is, hey, I'm so glad that you have come to me and that you're choosing to talk through this, because it's really important that we have a good relationship. I want to make sure that I'm here to support you, and that goes for everyone. Here's my best recommendation. Here's my best advice. And this is where you can kind of start to paint the picture. I would not be doing you any good if I just stepped in and solved this problem for you, because it's likely that you are going to continue throughout your career. You're going to continue to have these moments where you're going to feel some kind of way about the way in which someone has interacted with you. And I want to make sure that you feel empowered and that you know that you're empowered to address these concerns, whether you bring them to me or not. but to address them on your own. So I want to give you the tools to be able to do that. And I want you to know that you are empowered to confidently and appropriately and professionally handle this issue. So now you've set the stage with that, right? With that verbiage. Now you can kind of go into some advice for how to deal with this. And the advice I usually give is make sure that you walk through it. If you, whether you want to role play it with me or with someone else, I would make sure that if you role play with someone else, that it is not someone in the organization or that would be negatively impacted by your feelings around this situation, because we want to make sure that we are not coloring outside of the lines with things that can be sensitive about someone else's leadership or someone else's involvement in this situation. So, naturally, I would invite this person to role play and practice with me. And I also always advise that they work to actively remove emotion from their feedback, because really this is a feedback practicing moment. And I kind of take the opportunity to boil it down to that also, that this employee is in a moment of needing to provide feedback to the person that they are not happy with at present, and that the only way to really give constructive feedback that has an outcome that they're looking for is to really focus on providing facts and not being emotionally or reactively driven in sharing this information. Now, the third thing, and certainly not the last thing that I always focus on too, is that when giving the feedback, or when going into this type of conversation, the person should always have a clear goal in mind. So in this scenario, if I were to actually actively say this to this person, I would say, hey, when are ready to practice this, make sure that you're like writing down 3 bullet points of what you need to cover. What are the things that you want to address? How did it make you feel? And what do you need from that person? That at the very top of that page, you should have the goal. If the goal is to have an apology, write that. If your goal is to improve the working environment for yourself or the relationship between the two of you, have that as the goal. Whatever you do, every single part of that conversation has to be bookended by the goal. So this is an example of where we're getting involved by equipping someone with really, hopefully, really strong tools and resources. But actually, the best way that we're helping them in this way, other than those tools and resources, is again by empowering them and building their confidence. I think that is hands down one of the most important roles that we play as HR leaders, is knowing when not to step in and knowing when to take the longer route, the harder route, and going through all of those practice scenarios, walking through or role playing the situation, giving them tools, equipping the person with things, measures for success, so that they can continue to have successful conversations, but also so that they go into their career with a better understanding of what can help them to be more successful, because every single person is going to have an interpersonal conflict. So the more people we can equip with this knowledge and that we can empower, the stronger our organizations will be, in my opinion. So let's take a different situation where maybe it's a little bit more murky as far as where HR gets involved. Let's say, for example, someone comes to us and says, I'm really stressed. The work that I have, the workload that I have is really stressing me out. And I'm just like feeling so sick over it. There are a couple of reasons why someone might be coming to you with this. One, the obvious could be that they need a leave of absence or they need some resources, time off. They need to know what those resources are. Maybe the less obvious is that they're looking to just kind of vent it out and see, I don't know how they can work through this. The third, maybe even less obvious option is that it could be like, I don't, for a lack of a better term or phrase, a cry for help, in that maybe there's something deeper going on within their department, within their team, with their manager, that they are not fully comfortably sharing. So, my recommendation when someone comes to us with kind of like an open-ended, vague, this is how I'm feeling, and I could really use some help, is to ask a lot of questions. So, this again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get involved right away or that you're going to get involved directly in solving this problem, but you don't know that until you find out through like a question and answer moment. I don't want to say segment because this is not like a theater thing or a script, but it's kind of like building your muscle memory, so, and building your skill set as well to know when you have to dig a little deeper. I personally don't believe in taking anything at face value. I always try to uncover, like, peel back the onion and uncover what else there is. And sometimes there isn't anything, and that's okay, but you have to do the due diligence in asking those questions. Now, from one perspective, you have to ask more questions because now someone is citing stress, and potentially this could be, a work related thing and could result in this person needing to hear leave of absence, PTO options that are obligatory for us to share and inquire about. So I tend to, when someone cites something like stress or things like that or their health, I tend to lead with that. Like, hey, we have options. Like, if this is something that you need, here are the things that we offer. And I kind of go through that. And I would say most of the time people are like, well, I don't know. I don't know if I need that. Maybe I just need to take a day off. And this is a good opportunity for you to dig further. Even if someone says, oh, this is really great to know, thank you for those options, like, I'll let you know, don't let them run away. Don't let them hang up the call. That is still an opportunity for you to dig in and provide them support. People are coming to us with things, and we have to make space for them to feel comfortable in sharing this information. If you're listening to this or watching this and you're like, well, no one comes to me, you might have an opportunity to improve the relationships that you have within your organization. Relationships are everything. I've talked about this a million times over. Relationships are the most important thing that you build and focus on as an HR professional, because the better your relationships are, the better you'll have, the better the pulse you'll have on the organization and on teams, which is really one of the best ways for us to be able to positively influence and affect the organizations that we work for. So anyway, in this opportunity to ask more questions, this is where you're going to figure out how involved you need to be. If someone, as you're digging, if you're asking, well, when did this start? Have you shared this with anyone else? Does your manager provide specific resources for you? Have you shared that you're feeling this way with your manager? Some other questions might be, what do you do to prevent burnout? Is there anything that you do today to manage your stress levels? Because of course, stress is always going to come with work. Work is not meant to be fun 100% of the time. That's why we call it work. However, we want to make sure that there are, opportunities for you to feel like you have harmony in your work and your personal life. And then you can also ask questions like, well, is there something else, going on? Is whether, at home or at work, you obviously don't have to disclose anything personal, but, if there's something else going on, I would love to be able to support you, right? So these questions all have deeper purposes. When I ask a question like, well, how long has this been going on? It can help us to potentially point out if it's a result of an organizational change, management change, a change in the team, a change in their job function. If I ask a question like, have you shared this with your manager? And they say no, that might point to, well, why not? And we might not ask why not to that person. You could, but this could send a message for us that really says, well, maybe there's an issue there that we need to dig into. And then aside from that, if they haven't told their manager, if you can encourage them to tell their manager so that the manager is aware of that, this need to further or more effectively support their employee, that's also beneficial. Kind of going back to the initial situation or the first situation I shared. And then other than that, if I even ask a question as far as, well, what are you doing to manage your stress? If someone's like, well, I'm working 10, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week because, there's so much to do. not only could this point to, an organizational need as far as like headcount and the way that the organization is structured, but it also could point to the effectiveness of the operations within a team or an organization, and how businesses are ensuring that there is harmony in the day, because meetings are rough. When you're back to back in meetings, like you're not looking up and you're doing that, 5 days out of the week, it's rough. And there is an operational opportunity there for an organization to improve their operations. So, you can get a lot out of questions that help that person feel better because they're now sharing it and they feel that and they know that it's a safe space. But then on the other side of things, it's going to help you kind of diagnose the situation a little bit better. The questions are so important. And the more you do this, the better your questions are going to be. The better your questions are, the more intrinsic and intuitive these moments will be for you as an HR leader. So from those conversations, or I should say, from those answers, you can then decide and discern where you have to get involved. If at any point the conversation goes to, my manager is doing this, my manager is doing that, I'm really unhappy, and it's like a disgruntled thing, you're probably going to have to get involved more directly, because that employee is probably not going to go to their manager directly if they haven't already. And there's likely a need for you to step in. Now, I say this with an asterisk because you do have to be transparent if you get involved in that way. And so in those situations, when I've decided that I'm going to step in some way, or if I'm trying to decide if I'm going to step in directly, I will say to the employee, hey, how do you want this to be resolved? Do you want me to step in? Do you want to go to to your manager directly? How can we resolve this? And you kind of keep the ball in that person's court rather than taking on all of the ownership, because at the end of the day, we can only kind of like support both people in this, and we also only know one side of the situation. So we don't want to immediately, like de facto go to the person who's coming to me first is the one in the right, and the person who hasn't come to me yet is the one in the wrong. That is the wrong way to go about things. We have to take things with a grain of salt, actually at face value at first, to dig in. And then we have to really get another perspective, especially if the person says, well, I want you to be involved. So when you ask that question, or you kind of pose that opportunity to the, let's say, the complaining party or the person coming to you, that person then has a decision to make. Is this serious enough for them to say, yeah, I need you to get involved, I need you to step in? Or is this not serious enough where they still want HR support because they don't really know how to handle it? That's also okay. Or on the other side of things, is this something that they feel they are capable of handling themselves? If someone says, oh, you know what, actually, I want to manage this on my own, sometimes what I will do is I'll still say, hey, I would love to just connect on this further. I want to hear how the conversation goes. I also do want to stay close to the situation. So I might speak to your manager. I'm not going to share necessarily that, the contents of our conversation, unless there's a serious issue that this person obviously has shared with you. But sometimes I will say that, or sometimes I will go to the manager and say, hey, how are things going? Like, I want to understand, a little bit better what the working relationships are like. And also, I want you to be open if anyone on your team kind of comes to you with some feedback, because this is probably going to take a lot from them, right? So there is some caressing that you can do when there is, like, some sort of situation with a manager going on. And the better your relationships are, the more casually you can have these conversations and it won't feel like so awkward. But anyway, in this situation, if someone's like, no, I don't want to address this on my own, I don't know what to say, I don't want to do the wrong thing, can you just support me? Sometimes you're going to make a decision to have like a trio call or meeting where you're connecting with all parties. Sometimes you're going to decide that you have to connect with the manager first and understand their perspective and their side of things, and then have like what I would call a mediation, so that you can support the conversation as a neutral third party. And then other times, if the situation is really bad, you might actually have to remove the manager from the situation in order to focus on the person that is making, or formalizing some sort of complaint, which we'll get to in the third and final example. But you might have to remove that person and really work to understand what's going on. And then you're going to have to kind of double down on a mediation and evaluate if this is a relationship that can be, resolved, or a problem that can be resolved within maintaining the organizational structure. Sometimes it's just not that simple, depending on the situation. But obviously, I gave a pretty benign example of someone being stressed in the workplace, and it really could mean a multitude of things. But the only way we find out is by asking those questions. So in this example, again, you could be involved indirectly by equipping someone and empowering them, and you can be directly involved in helping to resolve the issue and actually mediating and mitigating the risk and mediating the issues. So, this is, again, the questions are going to be the most imperative and impactful part of that process. Now, the third and final example that I have for you is probably the most severe example that there is, which is when something is illegally done or a person's, privacy or rights have been violated. So let's take probably the most used example of a harassment claim. Um, the way I typically approach these things is kind of like the same way every time so that I'm consistent. I always say, hey, as a reminder, there is an expectation in good faith reporting. So in reporting this, you are formalizing the complaint, and I am trusting that you are making this complaint in good faith because I do have to launch an investigation. And then from there, I always share that, the contents of our conversation are not necessarily going to be confidential because of the severity of the situation. However, there is an anti-retaliation policy, and at no point will their name or personal information be shared at risk for, violating that policy. That policy is so critical to investigations that, there is no retaliation at all, and that it is prohibited. And so, in order to maintain that policy and ensure that they are not retaliated against, their the discretion is of the most concern, but that the contents of the conversation can't necessarily remain confidential, at least within, appropriate parties. And of course, there's always like a nervousness around that. But I try to reassure people that when it comes to situations like this, I don't go to, and I actually use this example, I'm not going to go to the person that you're filing this complaint about and say, hey, so and so told me that you did this. What are your thoughts? Like, that's not how investigations are handled. Instead, it's, hey, there was a report about this. I need to understand what happened. As of right now, there is an investigation into you as a participating party in this, and we need to understand what happened. So usually that tends to make the reporting party feel a little bit more confident in the situation, a little bit less nervous. But I always say, transparency is really important, and we have to be upfront about what we can and can't do. And depending on the situation, if it is harassment, and especially if there is, a level of harassment that can either be validated or is severe, like someone's physical space has been violated, their emotional space has been violated, you're kind of, again, discretion is advised here. Sometimes people claim harassment and it's not by definition harassment. And I say this because sometimes with harassment claims that are, more severe, you are going to potentially have to suspend the party that is being complained about, the alleged aggressor, if you will. So not in every situation will you have that, because again, if someone is saying that they were harassed, but really it was just inappropriate conversation or, disrespectful conversation, that's not necessarily harassment. So you wouldn't necessarily have to suspend that person. But in cases where it is more severe, you might. And I would advise you to consider suspension if something is severe, because it kind of elongates the time for you to be able to give a fair and thorough investigation, because suspensions should be paid and have to be paid. So you can remove that person, pay them. You don't have any risk there of any retaliation. You're removing them from the situation, and you're making the complaining party feel comfortable as well. Now, I've said this before on podcasts that kind of delve into this, and I'm going to say it again. You should never suspend or remove the complaining party. That is victim blaming. I'm not going to go ahead and say that every single person making a complaint is a victim or is always truthful. Obviously, that's not always the case. But when it comes to how you handle these situations, you have to remove the alleged aggressor, not the complaining party. It sends the wrong message, and it's not the right thing to do. You can disagree with me all you want, but that's where I stand, and I'm not willing to debate it. That's where I stand. Anyway, when it comes to that, if when you do step in, like, this is obviously, whenever something like this is going on, like this situation, you have to be involved directly. This is your most urgent part of your day when something like this happens. Everything else has to fall to the wayside. And if it's not, or if someone makes you feel like this isn't the most urgent, they are wrong. Like, this, handling these types of ER or employee relations issues is your top priority as it comes up. And with top priority ER issues, employee relations issues, you are absolutely directly involved. Sometimes you have to involve other HR leaders. Sometimes you have to involve the person's manager. It depends on the situation, of course. But again, your direct involvement is required at immediate response. And in this situation, you're going to have to launch a whole investigation. You have to, leave no stone unturned. And your responsibility is to work to understand what the situation is. Not every harassment claim is going to result in someone being fired. Not every harassment claim is going to result in someone being suspended or even put on corrective action. In the event that there's a situation where harassment is validated and corroborated, you're likely, and you should be, looking at corrective action up to and including termination. Where harassment is not so clear, but again, maybe it's kind of like disrespectful communication, you can get involved with some training for that person. You can absolutely, and I would encourage you to document or, provide corrective action to that person so that it is taken seriously. But it's kind of like all this gray area. It's like a rainbow, if you will, that what the way in which we have to deal with these things. Most of the time, you're probably going to take someone as a partner in making these final decisions, whether it's your leader or a legal representative, depending on the severity or the complexity of the situation. But you definitely have to think through where your involvement starts and stops. What really, in this type of situation, your involvement is going to stop when the investigation concludes and everything, you've taken your action plans and you've executed them, and it's, kind of resolved and done. Of course, your involvement starts the moment someone comes to you with this situation. If you want more information on when or where or how to deal with this kind of situation, let me know. I can absolutely dive into this deeper and go through kind of like all of those pathways when someone shares that they, feel they're being harassed or that they have been harassed in some way. And there is a lot that is covered by the harassment definition. So, even things like cyberbullying, bullying in general, um, intimidation, like all of those things can be harassment. Sometimes people won't, sometimes actually people will come to you, like, let's take that first example that I shared. They'll come to you saying they feel stressed, and then they talk about things that actually would fall under the definition of harassment. And you have to be able to hear and listen to what they're saying and then discern from there what that complaint is truly about. So that kind of goes back to the point that I made about asking a lot of questions and understanding where something has now taken a different form, and that maybe it's not just an interpersonal conflict, or maybe it's not just feedback for a manager, but actually it's deeper than that potentially. So that is where you are going to play an integral role in understanding where you need to escalate, where you need to de-escalate, and how you have to get involved. So as you continue to listen to these guest episodes, and if you haven't listened to the guest episodes from this month just yet, really think with a critical eye, like how have you been able to bring, this type of human centrism and focus on solving problems to your job. It doesn't matter if this is something that you deal with today. You do have to be able to have this skill set at any level in your career if you are in HR or if you are a people leader, because people leaders also need to know how to triage issues and how to escalate or de-escalate situations as well. So I hope that this was helpful. I absolutely can do a deeper dive. I can go into more situations. I can give more examples. I have tons and tons of stories that I can share. So just let me know, whether you email me at contact@hrtracy.com or you leave, a comment on an Instagram post or DM me. You can message me on LinkedIn too. You can also, if you're watching or listening on Spotify, you can share what you thought about this episode. That will definitely give me some data too, so I know if this is more so what you want to hear a little bit more of. But please feel free to reach out if you have a specific situation that I can support you with. Let me know. I'm happy to help as much as possible. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you next week. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.